had honestly said to myself, if there's one night, I hope we don't have a lot of new faces in it tonight, because I laid a lot of background in the weeks that led up to this week. And for those of you who weren't here for that background, I apologize if things seem to be sort of jumping into the middle, but we are literally jumping into the middle of a study. And what we've been studying is biblical translation. We spent quite a bit of time in the early parts of this class talking about principles of translation, considerations that go into translation, a lot of different things that have to do with that. And then we've been trying to go through pretty systematically and look at the really widely distributed translations, starting with the King James and working our way up. Now, we are by no means covering all translations. In fact, the world probably would not stand long enough for us to do a Wednesday night on every English translation of the Scriptures that's ever been made. There were literally hundreds, if not maybe thousands, between the American Standard and the Revised Standard, okay? There's been lots and lots of translations. So what I'm trying to do is pick the ones that are most widely distributed, or the ones that represented a really important step in the process of getting to the ones we have today, like the Revised Standard. I don't think you can have an intelligent discussion of modern day translations without looking at the transition that took place with the Revised Standard. Tonight we come to the New International Version, and what we're doing is we're simply proceeding in order of time. Last week we looked at the New American Standard Bible, and next week, Lord willing, we'll look at the New King James translation. And we're trying to look at a little bit about the history and the how that translation came to be. What are some of its defining characteristics, and then what are some of the benefits and some of the cautions that go along with each translation. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the history of the New International Version. It begins in the year 1955 with a businessman named Howard Long. Howard Long was discussing the Bible with a colleague of his in business, and the translation he was using was the King James translation. And he was frustrated in trying to have a discussion in 1955 with a colleague because of the difficulty of the language. His colleague was simply struggling with the King James language, the more arcane language that's found there. And he said to himself, I wish we had a translation that was easier to read to the modern English reader. And he went a step further and he said, I know a lot of parents who would love to be able to read the Bible to their little children and their little children be able to understand it. And I wish I had such a translation. So he went to his preacher at the Christian Reformed Church, and they discussed it, and his preacher thought it was a great idea. So they went to the hierarchy of the Christian Reformed Church and asked them to consider putting together such a translation. Now, this is in 1957 that the Christian Reformed Church decided to put together a committee to discuss the question of whether or not they ought to pursue the possibility of maybe collecting a group of people together who might produce such a translation. Sound about like, the bureaucracy of the way things are done, committees and so on and so forth. So 2 years later, they do in fact decide to form a committee to discuss the question of whether there ought to be such a translation. And about, from 57 to 64, in 1964, 7 years later, the committee joins together with the National Association of Evangelicals, and they decide to issue invitations to scholars all across the United States to come together and have a translation conference. Now, the translation conference was not to produce a translation. The translation conference was to discuss, one, whether we ought to do such a thing, and two, if we do, what would be kind of the ground rules of such an undertaking. And so here we are 9 years removed from the initial inception of the idea, and they have issued invitations. In 1965, the translation conference takes place at Trinity Christian College in Illinois, and they decide to undertake the making of the translation that they simply were calling at that time a contemporary English translation. In 1967, 2 years later, the New York Bible Society, which today goes by the name of Biblica, and is the publisher of the New International Version, decided that they would underwrite the translating process and hire the translators. And so for about the next 5 years, the translating work was underway, working specifically on the New Testament. And in 1973, the New International Version of the New Testament was published. 5 years later, in 1978, the whole Bible was published. Now, before we go any farther with that, I want to talk a little bit about who comprised, yes, sir.
Did they translate just from the King James?
No.
No original scripts?
No, not at all. In fact, they went to the most up-to-date original language compilations that they could get their hands on. In fact, they used, for the most part, the same ones that the New American Standard Bible translated from.
Yeah.
Just different committee using the same text. The people who did this translating work were pretty much across the board people that you would describe as mainline Protestant and evangelical, okay? Which I think is interesting because it tells us a couple of things. Number one, it tells us that contrary to some claims that you will read if you Google the question, is the NIV a good translation? It was not produced by people who are enemies of Christianity, nor was it produced by people who are enemies of the idea of bringing the Bible to us in an accurate form. It was not produced by people who necessarily intended to introduce any particular doctrinal persuasion. In fact, they took some steps to try to head off the idea of any particular doctrinal persuasion getting into the text. And one of the steps that they took was to hire translators from a broad array of evangelical denominations. And their idea was, we don't want this to be a Baptist translation or a Methodist translation or a Presbyterian translation or what have you. We want it to be a translation. 1978 is the original NIV. In 1984, they issued a revision. They called it a minor revision. The 84 NIV was the one that most people were familiar with for a good long while, until 2005. In 2005, the committee, and by the way, they kept a standing committee to keep working on this translation, just like the New American Standard did, to continue updating it as the English language changed. In 2005, the committee did two things. Number one, they issued an NIV that was updated to include gender equality language, which met with a scathing reaction in the United States. Not so much across the ocean. In Britain, it was much more easily accepted. But in the United States, especially among evangelical circles, it was very much rejected. And so a very much watered down version of that was published in the United States as today's New International Version, TNIV. Okay? In 2011, an update was really an overhaul. And it was an overhaul sort of on the same scale as when we talk about last week in the NASB, the 2005. Yes, sir.
What do you mean when you say a watered down version?
They watered down the gender inclusive language. Okay. And we'll talk about that in more specifics here in just a little bit. I'll jump ahead just a minute and tell you one of the things that a lot of people have continued to object to in the gender inclusive language is, all right, let's say Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of sinners, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and so on and so forth. So the word man there is a word that is understood to encompass humanity. It's not a gender-specific term, although there is a gender-specific word that would also be translated man. In that case, the word intends mankind, right? They would have translated that something like, blessed is the person or the human. No big issue there. because the word means mankind. Where the issue comes in is the pronouns that follow, that refer back to that word. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. They would translate that to they. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. Number one, it's not good grammar in English, because man is singular, they is a plural pronoun, right? So you're either going to have to do one of two things. Well, I guess one of three things. You can do what they did, which confuses the number of the word in English and is incorrect in both the Hebrew and the English as far as grammar goes. Number two, you can say he/she to try and preserve the gender inclusivity of it. Or number three, you can do as the NASB 2020 version has done and keep he throughout for your pronouns, but use person instead of man in verse 1. And so that was sort of the issue there. They really watered down the gender inclusivity in the TNIV that was introduced in the United States. Now in 2011, an NIV came in that was marketed and is today marketed as the NIV. And they ceased publishing TNIV and the 1984 version. They had long since ceased publishing the 1978 version. Okay, so if you go to Books A Million today and buy an NIV off the shelf, you're probably buying the 2011 NIV, unless they just happen to have some old stock. Okay, the 2011 NIV kept some of the gender inclusive language. And again, we're going to look at some specific examples and compare and contrast. Now, let's talk about some characteristics of the text. To Dave's question a minute ago, they worked from the latest versions of the original language text that they could get. And remember, for those of you who haven't been with us in previous classes, when I say the latest version of original language text, what I'm talking about is this. The original texts themselves, New Testament is almost 2,000 years old. Old Testament is even older than that. We do not have a single one of the original text. In other words, the Genesis that Moses wrote, the Matthew that Matthew wrote, so on and so forth. We have copies, and oftentimes copies of copies. One of the things we want to do in order to make sure that we have the words that were written by inspired men is to find the oldest possible copies we can get, because the older they are, of course, the closer in time to the original they are, and the less time there is for copyist errors to creep in. That's an ongoing process. Archaeologists are continuing today to unearth manuscripts, sometimes that are older than anything that we had. They're also continuing to unearth other examples of those ancient languages other than the Bible that allow us to have a greater context for understanding that language that's useful in translating work. In other words, to see how that word was used at the time in other contexts to sort of inform our definitions. So all of that is at work, and we're constantly compiling and updating as we continue to dig up new manuscripts. Anybody remember what the great archaeological find of the early 40s was with regard to, what was it?
Dead Sea Scrolls.
Dead Sea Scrolls, yes. The Dead Sea Scrolls predated any manuscript we had at the time of the Old Testament. They were older than the oldest manuscripts we had. Yes, sir.
Did you say it was the 1984 version that was rejected?
In the United States, no,
Right.
it was the 2005 NIV that they sold across the ocean.
Okay.
It just met with scathing rebuke, and so as a reaction,
What didn't they like about it other than the pronoun?
primarily the gender inclusive
That-
language.
okay.
That was the big objection at the time. For example, the Southern Baptist Convention rejected as a whole for use in preaching and teaching in Southern Baptist churches. They issued a letter to any of the Baptist bookstores and stuff and asked them not to carry it, things of that nature. So it was, Very unpopular here in the United States. Like I say, it didn't meet nearly so much resistance in Great Britain. And that brings up a point that I wanted to tell you, and probably should have told you a while ago. The International and New International Version was intended to reflect the idea that they were trying not to produce either a British translation or an American translation or an Australian translation or a translation that was necessarily peculiar to any of the English-speaking languages, but an English translation that would be useful in all of those countries. Okay, so they were trying to keep out Americanisms or Britishisms. Is that a word? You know what I'm saying. That's where the international comes from. All right. So characteristics. Number one, they did utilize the latest available original language text that they had available at the time. The Nestle-Aland 27th, I think, was the Greek text that they used, and the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia was the Old Testament text that they used. They wanted to translate into contemporary English. That was one of the original motivating factors in getting this project going in the first place, as opposed to the King James, the American Standard, the Revised Version out of England, all had kept the more archaic language, and they wanted to have contemporary English. The translation philosophy was a real bone of contention, and continues to be, for the NIV. And that was a philosophy that started in California with an English scholar by the name of, and I've lost it, Eugene Nida, that he called dynamic equivalence. Later on in his life, he called it functional equivalence. Let me read you a description of the concept behind this translation philosophy. This was the way Nida described it. Dynamic equivalence is a sense for sense translation, translating the meanings of phrases or whole sentences with readability in mind, whereas formal equivalence is a word for word translation, translating the meanings of words and phrases in a more literal way, keeping literal fidelity. Dynamic equivalence is the quality of a translation in which the message of the original text has been so transported into the receptor language or the target language that the response of the reader in the target language is essentially like that of the original readers in the original language. And so, in other words, the idea is to translate the meaning in a way that will produce an equivalent reaction in the reader to what the original language would have produced in the readers of its day. We've talked quite a bit in our previous studies, because the translations that we've looked at were of the formal equivalent philosophy, and that is that they adhere very closely, as much as possible, given the differences in languages, to the words of the original text, the phrasing, the word order where it's possible to do so, even so much so that oftentimes they would bring idioms from the original language into English that weren't native English idioms. And we've talked about some examples of that. NIV says no. Dynamic equivalence says no, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to try to get at what did the writer mean, and how would you say that in the most natural possible English. Okay? And so that was kind of their philosophy. Now, with that in mind, I want to look at a couple of passages to show you that sometimes that produces a different result than what you would have in a more formal equivalence type translation. Dakota, you've got your King James?
I do.
Good. I'm going to get you to read these passages as a counterpoint to what I'm reading, okay? So let's start in John 1, verse 19. In John 1 and verse 19, the NIV says this: "Now this was John's testimony when the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was." Dakota, would you read that, King James?
And this is the record of John, when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who art thou?"
Okay. Who sent priests and leaders? King James?
The Jews.
The Jews, okay. NIV says Jewish leaders. The word in the Greek is simply Jews. And what you have here is the NIV translators inserting the word leaders here because they believe that the author intended to say the leaders of the Jews, not the Jews as a people. Well, that may or may not have been the case. The issue here that people have seized upon is the word leaders is simply not found in the original language version of it. And they didn't put it in italics as some of the translations have when the translators supplied a word. They simply put it there as though it were in the text. So that would be an example. Look at John 21 and verse 5. All right, NIV says, he called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. Dakota?
Then Jesus saith unto them, children, have ye any meat? They answered him, no.
The word in the original is children. NIV translates it friends. Friends is not a translation or a meaning of the word that Jesus used. He used a word that means children, like the little children that are in class tonight. Now, was it a friendly term? Sure it was. It was certainly an endearing term that Jesus is using for his disciples, but the characteristic that's on display here is perhaps an affinity for what we might call interpretation as opposed to translation, if you see the distinction I'm making there. Okay? Let's look at Acts chapter 4 and verse 33. Acts 4 and verse 33. With great power the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there was no needy persons among them, for from time to time those who owned lands or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales. Dakota.
And with great power gave the apostles witness of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. Neither was there any among them that lacked, for as many as were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the prices of the things that were sold.
Okay. The distinction here is, in NIV it says, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them. In the King James it says, and great grace was, how does it go?
Was upon them all.
Was upon them all. Okay. The word God simply doesn't appear in the original language. Again, this is an interpretive decision that the translators made to say, whose grace? One possible reading of that text would be to mean that the favor of the people was toward the apostles and the church as it's growing. And the text, the original language text, doesn't tell you whose favor or whose grace is intended there. The translators here made a choice to say, well, it's God's grace. And it might be. That's a legitimate interpretation. But what it's not is a translation, you see. And again, the word God's doesn't appear in italics to notify the reader, hey, the translator supplied this. So what I'm showing you these, and we won't read them all, but what I'm showing you is the method of translation intends to convey what the translators thought the writer meant versus what the words actually are. Does that make sense? All right. Now, let's talk about some benefits and cautions in the moments we have left. One benefit of the NIV is that it is the best-selling English translation on the market today. Period, hands down. It surpassed the King James several years back, which means it is in the hands of a lot of people. The reason I say that's a benefit is because whether or not you like the specific nature of the translation, you have people reading the Bible in this translation, and as evangelists, we need to prepare ourselves to be able to teach the gospel through the translation that people have. Now, what I mean by that is this. It's going to be mighty difficult for me to set up a Bible study, and let's just say instead of King James, Dakota was an NIV guy, And I set up a Bible study with him, and I sit down with him at his house on the first night, and I say, all right, now let's get out your Bible. And he gets out his Bible, and I say, hey, what translation have you got there? And he says NIV, and I say, oh, that one's terrible. Here, use this one. How's he going to react to that?
It's a bad first impression.
Yeah, it's going to be off-putting to him at the very least. If I were in his shoes, I might be thinking, well, is this your translation that pushes your dogma? You see what I'm saying? I'm not interested in teaching anybody my religion. What I mean by that is I don't have a religion. There is what the Bible teaches, and then there's what the Bible doesn't teach. And what I'm interested in doing and what I'm interested in teaching others is what the Bible teaches. Okay? I need to begin where they are. Just like the apostles took people where they were and led them where they needed to go. There will probably be a point in studying with Dakota, if Dakota and I continue to study in this hypothetical situation, where I might say to him, hey, have you ever thought about maybe looking at some different translations that might help you on some of these spots where, you know, there's some odd readings, things of that nature, and we might have that discussion. It's not going to be on the first day. It's not going to be in the first 5 or 6 days that we study together. You see what I'm saying? So it's out there. It's easy to read. Probably, I might should have put that at the top of the list. It is a very easy to read translation because of the emphasis that the translators placed on making the English natural. They got away from the word order and the phraseology of a foreign language and conveyed it into native English language. Yes, sir.
If the English language has evolved over the last 300 to 400 years, then who's to say that the original Greek or the Greek language has not done the same over the last 2,000, and that the people who are translating the way they understand Greek is different to the way it was originally written?
It's a good question. And the main answer to that is that the Greek of the New Testament is a dead language. It's not continuing to be spoken. And so it doesn't continue to pick up new meanings and new phrases. Same's true of the Hebrew of the Old Testament. It actually stopped being spoken in vernacular after the Babylonian captivity. I mean, they continued to read from it in the synagogue, but it wasn't the language of the street. That was Aramaic after that. So we have 2 dead languages, basically, that we're translating from, and that sort of pinpoints them at a point in time and says, okay, at this point in time, this is what this meant based on contemporary source materials. Good question. Good question. So the ease of reading makes it a very attractive translation to a great many people. As a matter of fact, you know what I believe the second or third most widely sold translation is? The Living Bible Paraphrase, which is not a translation at all. It's a paraphrase. It's a paraphrase of the American Standard Translation, actually. But what that tells me is you have a lot of people who have a lot of interest in trying to get their hands on a Bible that makes sense to them when they read it. Okay? And that in itself is not a bad thing. That's something I want to encourage and develop. And so I want to be very careful how I handle the translation issue, even if I have some qualms about the dynamic translation, dynamic equivalence theory. My biggest qualm is very simply because the Apostle Paul said, we speak the things which eye has not seen and ear has not heard and which have not entered into the heart of man. We speak them in words which the Holy Spirit teaches, combining spiritual things with spiritual words, which tells me that the actual words that the apostles and the prophets wrote were the words that God intended. Now, how he went about including their own vocabularies and styles, I truly do not know. I'll have to get to heaven and find out. But I know that the Bible claims for itself verbal inspiration. When I have a translation that says, essentially, we're more interested in thought by thought than word by word, that concerns me a little bit because the words are what the Bible says were the inspired thing. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, I say all of that to say, I'm not telling you if you read the NIV it's wrong and you're a sinner and it's a horrible thing. Okay, that's not what I'm here to. I'm not here to tell you any translation is you should throw it out the window or you should absolutely read from this one. I'm trying to show us strengths and weaknesses here, okay? The great weakness, in my opinion, of the NIV is the translation philosophy, and that's simply because it doesn't hew as close to the inspired words as we can possibly get, okay? Let's look at a couple of other passages. Galatians 5:19 was one of many texts in the 1984 NIV, where the Greek word sarx was translated sinful nature. The problem is, now, by the way, the 2011 NIV has fixed that. The word sarx simply means flesh. It could be human flesh, it could be the flesh of an animal, it could be any kind of flesh. But the word simply means flesh. It has no concept of sinfulness in it, inherently. Okay? The translators, many of them coming from a Calvinist background, translated the word sarx in many places in the New Testament, sinful nature. They came back in the 2011 version and took that out of all but one that I know of, and the one is Romans 7:25, where the word is still translated sinful nature there. But that's not translated. The words sinful and nature simply don't appear in the Greek there. The word is sarx, which means flesh. Okay? That's a problem. 1 Peter 3:21. Let's look at that one just a minute. Cody, you got yours ready?
Will shortly.
Okay. 1 Peter 3:21, NIV. Speaking of the water of the flood, and this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also, not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience toward God. All right, Dakota, would you read for me?
The like figure whereunto even baptism doth also now save us, not the putting away of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God, by the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Okay. The answer of a good conscience toward God, King James. Somebody got New American Standard? Anybody? Would you read for me?
Corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Daniel, read yours again.
Okay.
Daniel.
Sir.
Read yours again.
Not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience toward God.
Read the first part of the verse.
Oh, okay, and this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you.
Okay.
Also, not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience toward God. The word at issue here is the word that's translated answer, King James, appeal, New American Standard, pledge in the NIV. The argument has been that the NIV translators did not believe that baptism was in any way a prerequisite to salvation, but rather was an act of a saved person sort of commemorating or corroborating the fact of their salvation to God. And so they translate it as a pledge rather than someone who is a sinner saying to God, give me a good conscience, which the New American Standard, I think, pretty clearly brings out. So that was an issue. I'm running out of time. Ephesians 5:19 is an interesting one. Dakota, I'm not going to make you read that for the sake of time. Speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, sing and make music from your heart to the Lord. King James says, speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. I think that's a more accurate translation of the King James there, because it is making melody in the heart, not making music from the heart. I can make music from the heart on any instrument I choose, can I? I could play a saxophone and make some very heart-moving music, couldn't I? But the instrument that's in view there in Ephesians 5:19 is the heart. The word means plucking the strings of the heart. Is there somebody else?
The ESV translates it as with your heart.
Making music with your heart?
Yes.
Okay, interesting. All right, let's get down to the gender inclusive language, because you had asked about that. Oftentimes you have the introduction of they for a single singular masculine pronoun. That's problematic. let me look at a couple of passages. Let's look at Matthew 18:15 very quickly. Dakota, if you'll get this one for me. All right, Matthew 18:15, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. All right, now, I think NASB 2020 is also going to say if we're your brother or sister. They're going to put or sister in italics to let you know that the translators have supplied it to let us know they don't. The 2020 doesn't? It just says brother?
It just says if your brother sins.
Okay, interesting. All right.
And continues with the he pronouns.
He, yes. Okay, NIV says brother or sister, no italics. Go and point out not his fault, but their fault. Well, grammatically in English, that doesn't work, does it? Because you're talking about a singular subject and now all of a sudden you're referring to it with plural pronouns. Dakota, read it for me in the King James, please.
Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother.
Okay, so you see the singulars, that was an issue. Let's see, John 14:23, very quickly.
Daniel, it does seem like their intent though, like right here, the 2023 gender inclusivity term versus the gender inclusion that they're meeting or using when they're translating. Now it's meant to muddy the waters. It seems like with their purpose of translation is to say, okay, when it says man, it's specifically talking about man. For example, 1 Timothy 3, when it's talking about the qualifications for an elder, it still sticks with the he. It doesn't say they, his, her, anything like that. So it's almost like it tries to make it simpler to say, when it says man, it's talking about males,
Yes.
not all people. And I think that's probably an important point to make because, like I said, now it's, what you see gender inclusivity on Fox News and CNN is completely different.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. The intention, even of the NIV translators, was not in some way to say that gender doesn't matter. What they were trying to distinguish from was the words that must specify a male from the more inclusive words like anthropos, which simply means man in the generic, mankind, right? And I do not believe that the NIV translators were intending to in any way muddy the waters on the identity of the difference between males and females. I don't believe that at all. I think what they were trying to do was the same thing the NASB translators were trying to do, and recognize the fact that in modern English, we simply don't use the generic masculine anymore to refer to all people. I think the NASB translators probably handled it better, for one thing because they didn't use they and their, which muddies the water in terms of number. But it's a touchy thing. And I said last week, I think the 2020 NASB is going to come along in very soon years with another revision to try to clear up some of the unwieldy phrases that produces. I hope this has been helpful to you. It's a lot to cover. If you have questions or comments, I'll be glad to take those after class, but you're dismissed.
I believe a member of the Harding staff was on the